Hello, and welcome back. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you are, whatever the day held for you, you can set it down now. Let your hands go still. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called Arrival of the Flintloc, a tale set in a village so high in the mountains that it lives above the winter clouds, where the cold is old and deep, and the stone walls of every house hold the memory of every fire that has burned in them. And on one particular winter night, Rowan, a young shepherd who has kept the village's Highland flock for 3 seasons, watches something descend from the highest ridge she has never climbed. Something ancient, vast, and made of the deep earth itself, arriving after a journey of centuries. This is a story of watching, of the courage that is not loudness but stillness, and of the warmth that very old things carry with them when they finally come home. We'd love to hear from you before we begin. Where are you tonight, and what drew you to this particular story? Leave a thought in the comments when you wake. We read them all, and they shape what we create next. If you'd like to go deeper with us, our Patreon is a quiet place where early stories wait for those who want to be part of something closer. And if Terranash has become part of your evenings, a subscription costs nothing and means everything. It keeps this world going, one story at a time. Now let yourself settle. Feel the weight of your body against whatever holds you. With each breath in, let a little more quiet arrive. With each breath out, let the day move further away until it is just a shape at a distance, unthreatening and small. You are safe here. You are warm. When you're ready, let's climb together into the cloud and the cold and the particular quality of silence that only exists above the world, where Rowan is already waiting, watching something enormous and ancient come down from the dark of the ridge. The volcano's secret. Narration. The village of Caer Thul sat above the clouds. This was not a metaphor. In winter, when the moisture from the lower valleys rose and thickened and pressed itself against the mountain's middle slopes, the cloud layer settled somewhere around the 300-meter mark, and everything above it, including Caer Thul, which sat at 412, was simply above. The village existed in a different atmosphere, clearer, colder. The sky at night was a different sky than the one the valley people saw. Rowan had grown up with this as the ordinary texture of her world. The cloud below was called the floor in the village's common speech, and the valley below it was called simply the low. She had been down to the low several times, for the seasonal markets, for the 2 winters she had spent with her aunt learning the lower flock's habits before being assigned the high. And each time she returned to Caer Thul, she felt the particular relief of arriving back at the altitude her body was calibrated for. The air here was thin enough that newcomers were breathless for days. To her, it was the only right density of air. Everything else was too thick. She was 22 years old and had been keeping the village's Highland flock for 3 seasons. The sheep that wintered on the high ridge, the hardy breed that could find food under shallow snow, and that moved in the cold with a deliberateness that she had always found calming to watch. She knew every animal in the flock by its particular gait and the quality of its attention. Rowan knew the ridge by every rock and hollow. The shepherd knew the patterns of the weather by the way the cold hung over the ridge's eastern face an hour before a storm arrived. She did not know what she was watching descend from the highest point of the ridge on the 43rd night of that winter. She had been sitting at the shepherd's stone, a flat boulder, wind-smoothed, on the western edge of the ridge's highest accessible pasture, watching the flock's slow movements in the dark. The night was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that had a quality of cleanliness that pressed against the skin with intention. The stars above her were the high-altitude stars, which were different from the valley stars, brighter, more numerous, more present, as if the reduction in atmosphere between them and the ground had allowed them to arrive more completely. She noticed it first as a change in the quality of the cold, not warmer, not less cold, something different, a warmth underneath the cold, the way you sometimes find a current of almost warm water within a cold river, moving in the same direction but distinct. She had felt it before, in the rock of the ridge itself on certain mornings when she pressed her palms flat against the stone, a warmth that the rock held from deep below, from the geological processes that generated heat at depth so far below the surface that they had nothing to do with the sun. She looked toward the highest ridge. The Flintloc moved slowly. She would learn over the course of that night and the nights that followed that this was simply its nature, that its pace was the pace of geological time, compressed into something that could be observed in a single human lifespan, which was still slow by the measure of any creature she had encountered. It took an hour to descend from the ridge's highest point to the pasture where she sat. She watched it the entire time. It was large, not so large that it could not be comprehended. She had seen icebergs carved from the glacier on the mountain's northern face, had watched the slow movement of a landslide once from a safe distance, had understood large natural things before, but large in the way that large natural things are large, not as something that dwarfed other things in a threatening way, but as something that simply occupied a different scale, that moved according to a different set of physics, that existed at a remove from the ordinary categories of living creatures. Its body, and body was the word she used in her mind, for lack of a better one, was made of stone. Not carved stone, not assembled stone, but stone in the way that a living thing's body is the medium it is made of, with the same seamless rightness. Dark basalt at its base, which she recognized from the composition of Kaya Thul's own foundations. Lighter granite higher up, shot through with veins of quartz that caught the starlight and returned it in points and flashes. And at its upper surfaces, the broad, flat areas she was slowly understanding as its head, the raised portions that might have been its shoulders, something that glowed, faint and deep and warm, a reddish amber that moved in slow pulses, like embers that have been burning for a very long time and have settled into a steady, patient heat. She was not afraid. This surprised her later, thinking back on it. She would have expected fear, expected the instinctive animal alarm that her body produced in response to a predator in the dark, the particular quickening of the blood that was not a choice but a reflex. She did not feel it. What she felt instead was a kind of recognition, which she had no explanation for and did not try to find one. The recognition of something you have known existed without ever having been told it existed. She stayed where she was on the shepherd's stone. The Flintloc came to rest at the far edge of the pasture. It was perhaps 30 meters from where she sat. At that distance, she could see it in more detail, could see the texture of its surface, the complex architecture of its composition, the way the glowing portions at its upper body moved in rhythm with something she could only call breathing. Long, slow, immensely patient breathing. The kind that a mountain makes, if mountains breathe. The flock had moved away from it, not panicked, not the disorganized flight of prey animals before a predator. They had simply moved with calm certainty to the far end of the pasture and resumed their slow movements there, as if making a practical adjustment to the new arrangement of the landscape. If the animals were calm, the thing was not a threat. The flock knew the land better than she did. She stayed until dawn. She watched the Flintloc the way she watched the weather, with the patient, accumulative attention that her work had taught her, cataloguing what she observed without rushing toward conclusions. The way its warmth radiated outward in the cold, so that the space around it, within a radius of perhaps 10 meters, was noticeably less cold, the air above it shimmering slightly with the thermal differential. The way it occasionally shifted, minor adjustments, small movements of its enormous body, no single movement faster than the passage of a cloud shadow, and the sound those movements made, which was the sound of deep stone against deep stone, felt in the chest before it reached the ears. She noted that the glowing portions of its body pulsed on a regular interval. She counted 11 seconds between the brightening and the dimming, consistent across every measurement she made that night. She thought about the stories. Kaya Thul had a body of stories about what lived in the mountain, in the deep mountain, below the ridge and below the surface geology, in the heat and pressure of the interior. The stories were old, older than the current form of the village, older than the version of the language they currently spoke, preserved in the particular amber of tales told by grandparents to grandchildren, in the long winter nights when there was nothing to do but keep the fire and pass the time with words. The stories agreed on certain things, that there were presences in the mountain that had been there before the first person climbed this high, that these presences were not hostile, but were simply old in a way that human beings found difficult to comprehend, that they moved on timescales that made seasonal time look like a heartbeat. The stories called them different things in different versions: sleepers, stone warm, deep heart. One version, the one her grandmother had told, which was the version she had thought of as the real one, even as a child, without knowing why. Used the word Flintloc. She had not thought about those stories in years. They had been the furniture of her childhood, and she had carried them into adulthood the way you carry the contents of a house you grew up in, present, familiar, not often examined. Standing at the shepherd's stone in the clear, cold dark, watching the pulse of deep amber light in the body of the thing that had come down from the ridge, she examined them now. She wondered what it would be to carry something for as long as the stories implied, to hold something through time, to move so slowly that the events that humans called history passed around you in what would register at your scale as a brief afternoon, to have been present when there was no village here, no ridge path, no shepherd's stone. She thought about what it had been carrying. The warmth, she decided. That was what it was carrying. The warmth of the deep earth, which had nowhere else to go, which could only express itself as it had always expressed itself, slowly through stone into the cold. She came back the next night. She had not told anyone in the village what she had seen, not because she thought she would not be believed. Kaya Thul was a village that had always taken the mountain's deeper presence seriously, and an account from the shepherd of the high flock would be weighed carefully. But because she was not yet ready to share it, because some things needed to be understood before they could be translated into the social language of community knowledge. She sat at the shepherd's stone and she waited. The flintlock was still in the place where it had settled the night before. Its stillness had the quality of deep stillness, not the stillness of a thing that had stopped moving temporarily, but the stillness of a thing that had settled into a position that expressed its relationship to the place. She began to talk. She talked about the flock, about the individual animals, their habits and preferences, the particular hierarchy that had established itself this season. She talked about the winter so far, which had been colder than the last two, but drier, the snowfall lighter and easier to manage. Rowan talked about the village, about the specific community of a place this small and this isolated, the way everyone knew everyone's business, and the way this was, mostly, not a burden, but a warmth. She was not sure why she was talking. The flintlock showed no visible response to her voice, none of the behavioral cues she would have recognized from the animals as signals of attention or awareness. But she continued with the same calm persistence she brought to all of her work, because it felt right to continue. On the third night, she noticed that the interval of the amber pulse had changed. Not longer, not shorter, different. The rhythm had a quality of variation that it had not had on the first night, subtle shifts within the regular interval, almost like she held the word away from herself for a moment, then let it arrive, like someone adjusting their breathing when they become aware that they are being observed. She sat in the cold and let herself be as present as she knew how to be. After a long time, she felt the warmth increase. She noticed the rhythm of it in her own body. This was a thing that happened slowly enough that she would not have been able to name the moment when it began. But at some point in the middle weeks of winter, she became aware that her breathing, when she sat at the shepherd's stone, had settled into a pattern that matched the flintlock's pulse. Not exactly. She breathed faster, her lungs much smaller than whatever processed air through that vast geological body. But in ratio, 6 of her breaths for every one of its pulses. Patient and even. The way breathing becomes when it is not monitored, when the body finds its own rhythm in the absence of demand. She noticed it on a night when the cold was extreme and the breathing was the most visible thing in the air. The small clouds of vapor from her exhalations appearing and disappearing in the dark. The larger, slower exhaust of the flintlock's warmth rising from its body in a broader thermal shimmer. 2 different scales of the same process, 2 different rates of the same rhythm. She had thought her whole life that the deep mountain was simply the ground underfoot, a stable and indifferent substrate, the base on which everything else happened. The stories had suggested otherwise, but stories were stories. What she was experiencing at the shepherd's stone was something else. Not an argument, not a proof, but a direct encounter with the fact that the ground underfoot was not indifferent, had never been indifferent, had been present in its own way to everything that happened on its surface. She thought about what it must have been like to watch all of that without being noticed, without anyone sitting still long enough to feel the warmth in the rock, without anyone slow enough to hear the pulse, without anyone whose world was quiet enough for the message to reach them. She looked at the flintlock across the pasture, its amber glow steady in the dark. She thought, I am listening. And she pressed her palms against the warm rock of the shepherd's stone and felt the warmth rise through her hands, and she stayed as long as the cold allowed. The warmth was not like heat from a fire. fire heat was directional. It came from a source and moved outward. And you felt it most intensely on the side of your body that faced it, the far side remaining cold. This warmth was different. It arrived from below, from the rock under the shepherd's stone, through the wool of her coat, into her legs and the soles of her feet and the base of her spine. It was the warmth of the deep earth, exactly as she had felt it occasionally in the rock during a warm morning, but more present, more intentional, more immediate. She put her hands flat against the shepherd's stone. The stone was warm under her palms. She stayed very still and let the warmth move through her hands and up her arms and into her chest, where it settled like something she had been missing, without knowing she had been missing it. A particular kind of warmth, specific and old, that had nothing to do with the warmth of any fire she had ever sat beside. It was the warmth of geology, the warmth of processes that had been operating since before the mountain was a mountain, the warmth of the deep interior of the earth, which had been producing heat since before the first living thing existed on the surface above it, which would continue to produce heat long after every living thing had changed beyond recognition. She thought about continuity. She was 22 years old. Her grandmother, who had told her the stories, had been 81 when she died. Her grandmother's grandmother had kept the same flock on this same ridge, had sat at the shepherd's stone on clear, cold nights and watched the same stars and felt, perhaps, the same warmth in the rock beneath her. The lineage of the flock itself was even longer. The breed had been in the mountain for more generations than anyone had counted, adapted to this specific altitude and this specific cold over a span of time that the village's memory did not clearly reach. And beneath all of that, beneath the lineage of the flock and the lineage of the shepherds and the lineage of the village and the lineage of everyone who had ever climbed this high and sat at this stone, the Flintloc, beneath everything, carrying its warmth through all of it. She understood, sitting with her hands on the warm rock, what the stories had been trying to say. Not a threat, not a deity, not in the way that words like deity implied hierarchy and demand, simply a presence. The oldest presence in the mountain, the thing that had been here first and would be here last, patient as the interior of the earth. She kept her hands on the stone until the cold forced her to put her gloves back on. Then she kept them there anyway, gloved, feeling the warmth through the wool and the leather. The Flintloc pulsed its amber light in the dark at the far end of the pasture, slow and even, patient as it had always been patient, carrying its warmth through the centuries and the stone. She told the village on a Sunday afternoon in late winter. She told them in the way that things are best told in a small community that has a relationship with the mountain, not with alarm, not with ceremony, but practically in the context of the shepherd's weekly report to the village council. She described what she had observed and answered the questions that followed honestly and without elaboration. The village had listened carefully. The older members of the council had exchanged particular looks, the looks of people who have been told something that confirms something they had always privately believed without evidence. No one had climbed to see. She had not suggested they should. Some things were right to approach slowly. The mountain had taught her this. The flock had confirmed it. Some presences were not frightened or threatened by patience, but welcomed it. The patience of letting time accumulate into understanding before anything was required of anyone. She had told the Flintloc about the conversation, the night after it. She had described the council's faces, the particular quality of the silence after she finished speaking. Rowan had described the walk home through the village afterward, the way the houses looked in the early dark, the lights in the windows, the smoke rising from every chimney. The Flintloc had pulsed its amber light in the dark. 11 seconds, then 12, then back to 11. The small variation. The variation she had come to associate with its most attentive states. She had sat with her hands on the shepherd's stone and felt the warmth of the deep earth rising through the rock. And she had felt, not for the first time and not for the last, entirely at home. The first elder to climb came on a Tuesday near the end of the second month of winter. Her name was Breda, and she was 71 years old and had lived her entire life in Caerthul, had been born there and had watched the ridge and the high meadow through every season of those 7 decades. She walked with 2 sticks now. The path to the upper pasture was steep, and the ground was hard with frost. Rowan had offered to describe it instead, to sketch it in words the way she'd been doing all winter, and Breda had said that she was not so old she couldn't walk a hill, and had said it in a way that closed the conversation. They went up together in the early dark, when the stars were still bright above the ridge and the lamps of the village were just beginning to dim. Rowan carried both their lanterns. Breda moved slowly and without apology, and Rowan found herself grateful for the pace. The slowness of it made the ascent feel like something deliberate rather than an errand, each step its own act, the ground rising beneath them unhurried. At the shepherd's stone, Breda stopped. She set her sticks against the rock and looked across the pasture at the Flintloc. She said nothing for a long time. The amber light pulsed its 11-second measure in the cold dark. Then Breda said, "My mother's mother used to speak of something like this. Not in those words, but a presence in the high rock. A warmth that came up through the earth in the old winters. She said it was older than the village. She said it had been there when the first families came up out of the valley and built their first walls from whatever stones they could carry." Rowan said, "Did anyone go to it?" Breda said, "She didn't speak of anyone going to it. She spoke of it the way you speak of the weather. Something that was there and was not yours to approach. Something you were glad existed." They sat in silence after that, both of them watching the pulse. Breda did not move to go closer. She did not ask questions about the 11 seconds or the composition of the amber glow. She sat at the shepherd's stone and looked, and the looking was its own kind of attention, the kind that does not need to become something else. When they went down, Breda said only, "I understand why you kept going up." 3 more elders came up in the following weeks, in 1s and 2s, and then a small group of children whose parents had agreed it was all right, 6 of them, ages 8 to 12, who came in the afternoon when the light was still good and walked across the pasture with the particular seriousness of children who understand they are in the presence of something that deserves seriousness. The children asked questions that the elders had not. One of them, a girl of 10 named Seren, asked whether it was asleep. Rowan said she didn't think so, that she thought it was awake in whatever way was natural to it, which might not look like wakefulness, but wasn't absence. Seren considered this and then asked whether it was lonely. Rowan said she had wondered that herself, and that she had come to think it probably wasn't, that its experience of time was so different from theirs that the word might not apply in the way it applied to a person. She said, "I think it is simply what it is, and what it is seems to be enough for it." Seren looked at the Flintloc for a long time after that. Then she said, "I think if I were a rock that big, I would want someone to visit. and she said it plainly and without sentimentality as a factual observation, and Rowan found she had no counter-argument. On the way down, one of the older children, a boy named Cale, 12 years old and already apprenticed to the stonemason, stopped partway down the path and looked back up at the ridge. He said, "How long has it been there?" Rowan said, "Longer than anyone can say, longer than the village." He thought about this. Then he said, "Do you think it knows we're here? Like that there's a village and people and everything?" Rowan said, "I think it knows something is here. What that knowing is like for something that old, I can't say." Cale nodded as though this was a reasonable answer. He turned and went on down the path. The others followed. Rowan was last to leave, and she stopped where Cale had stopped and looked back once at the high dark of the meadow, the faint amber warmth at its far edge, the specific quality of the cold and the stars. She thought, this is what it is to tend something, not to own it or understand it or explain it, only to be present to it, only to come back. She went down. On the last night of winter, the night before the calendar turned, and the village began the ceremonies that marked the season's change, Rowan climbed to the pasture earlier than usual. The sky was clear, and the stars were at their high-altitude intensity, dense and close, the way they were only on the coldest clear nights when the atmosphere was at its thinnest and most transparent. The cold was the cold of winter's last assertion, not as fierce as the deepest winter cold had been, but present and complete, the air so still that her breath hung for a long moment before dissipating. She sat at the shepherd's stone, and she was quiet for a long time before she spoke. Then she told it about the year. She told it the whole of it, from the early days of autumn, when the flock had been brought up to the high pasture for the last season's grazing, before winter closed in, through the first snows and the establishment of the winter routine, through the 43rd night when she had watched something come down from the highest ridge. She told it about the quality of the cold, the quality of the stars, the particular silence of the 7 hours between that first sighting and the dawn. Rowan told it about the warmth she had felt in the rock. She told it about her grandmother, who had kept a lamp lit and told the stories, and who had given her the lamp and who had said, handing it over, something that Rowan had not understood fully at the time, that the lamp was not for seeing in the dark, because you could always find a way to see in the dark if you needed to. The lamp was for being seen, for being visible to whatever was in the dark with you, for saying, with the small, specific language of light, "Here I am. I am not trying to hide." She set the lamp on the shepherd's stone and lit it. The flame burned in the still, cold air. Across the pasture, the Flintloc's amber glow pulsed. 11 seconds, 11 seconds, 11 seconds. Patient and vast and old. She sat in the warmth that came up through the rock and watched the spring arrive in the quality of the dark, in the slight loosening of the cold, in the way the stars at the eastern horizon had a quality that was different from the winter stars, a quality of arrival rather than residence. The morning after, she climbed the path to the upper pasture one more time before the ceremonies began. The day was clear and cold and bright, the sun already above the ridge's eastern edge, moving through the specific quality of high-altitude morning. The Flintloc was where it had been all winter. She stood at the shepherd's stone and looked at it in daylight for the first time, had always seen it in the dark and the starlight and the lamplight, never in the full light of morning. It was different in the day. Its surface had a quality she had not fully understood in the dark, the complexity of its composition visible, the different stones and their relationships to each other, the quartz veins that in daylight were not luminous but translucent, admitting the light and showing their internal structure. The amber glow of its deep furnaces was less visible in the day, but not absent. She could see it in the shadowed areas, in the recesses and joints of its structure, a warmth that existed independently of the sun. She said, "Thank you." It was not exactly what she meant. She did not have the words for what she meant, which was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of having been given access to something that had not needed to be given, that had been given anyway, that had changed the quality of the world as she moved through it. The flintlock did not respond in any way she could identify, but the warmth in the rock beneath her feet was present and real, and the air above its body shimmered faintly in the morning cold, and she stood in the clear high light and felt, one last time before the ceremonies and the village and the turning of the season, the patience and warmth of something incomprehensibly old. She picked up her lamp. She went down. The year was ending. Another would begin. The flintlock had been here for all the years that had preceded this one. It would be here for all the years that followed. And she would climb up to this stone, she understood, for as long as her legs carried her, would sit in this cold and this warmth and this particular quality of stars, and would light her lamp, and would be present to the presence that had always been here, and would speak into the dark, and would listen to whatever answered, not in words, in warmth, in the particular pulse of amber light at 11-second intervals, in the quality of the rock under her hands. The night held everything gently, the flock and the pasture, the shepherd and the stone, the ancient presence at the far edge of the meadow, the village below, the valley in the clouds, the low world beyond it, held all of it in the same patient dark, without preference or distinction, as it had always held it. And the warmth rose through the rock, and the cold began, very slowly, to loosen its hold. And Rowan sat in the place between winter and spring, tending her lamp, watching the dark, entirely and completely at home.